we have to look at meekness, because meekness plays a big part in our learning to do this very thing, to deny self. And yet, meekness is not the easiest word to define. And one of the reasons it's a hard word in and of itself, but what makes it even more difficult is the ideas that people come up with. And they get those ideas entrenched in their minds, and it's hard to dispel those ideas that they have. And what I mean by that is that when you mention the word meek or meekness to some people, they automatically think of weakness. That's what they associate the word meekness or meek with. If you're meek, you're weak, is really what is the way they look at it. And this concept is, I think, a very widely held definition that most people, far too many people, have. There are other people who think meekness is one of those qualities that over which you don't really have no control. That's their concept of meekness. Meekness is something that to them you either have it or you don't. You either are born with it or you're not. So that's their concept of meekness. It's something that they really, and no one really has control over. Either you have it or you don't. So when you think about these ideas that people have, plus you add to that the fact that meekness itself is not one of those easy words to define, then I think that helps us to see that it's important for us to consider in our lesson tonight the definition of meekness. And certainly this is not going to be the only lesson dealing with meekness. So I've already had one question posed on the part of an individual, but before you ask all your questions, there's going to be two more lessons that we're going to look at meekness, because it has such an important part in the playing of self-denial, and yet it's so difficult to define. I think it's certainly not going to be something that we can do justice by just looking at it in one lesson. So tonight we're going to look at the definition. Tomorrow night, not tomorrow night, but I'm not in a gospel meeting here. Next Wednesday night, Lord willing, we'll look at some examples of meekness. And then in the third lesson, we want to look at not only seeing those examples in others, but how do we make the application ourselves of meekness? So there's going to be this lesson and two more that we're going to be dealing with this subject. And I don't think we're belaboring the point, because, like I said a moment ago, meekness is one of those words that's just really hard to get a handle on. And when there's so many false concepts and ideas, then that doesn't help the matter either. So despite these ideas and these concepts that people have about the word, one thing we know for sure: God demands that we be meek. He commands us to be meek. And these are by no means all of the verses that we're going to or ought to look at, but these at least helps us to establish the fact that meekness is something that God requires, God demands of us. And one of those passages that we see is that the meek of the earth were told to seek God. And Zephaniah chapter 2, getting too far ahead of myself. Zephaniah chapter 2 and verse 3, Reuben, read that for us.
Seek the Lord, all you meek of the earth, who have upheld his justice. Seek righteousness, seek humility. It may be that you will be hidden in the day of the Lord's anger.
All right, here's the word meek, and this is the word you see in the King James, and you also see it in the New King James. If you're looking at the New American Standard, that word meek is translated humble. It's in the New American Standard, and it's also translated that word in the English Standard Version. So I want to look at these verses, but I want us to look at these other translations again in an effort to help us to see other words that have been incorporated that hopefully maybe will help us to better give definition to the word meek. We know that in contrast to the outward adorning, Peter says that a woman should wear the ornament of a meek and a quiet spirit. Brother Rodney, read that for us in 1 Peter 3, verse 4.
But let it be the hidden man of the heart, in that which is not corruptible, even the ornament of a meek and quiet spirit, which is in the sight of God, great prize.
All right, the word meek, that's the reading in the King James Version. If you were looking in the New King James, the New American Standard, or the English Standard, you would see the word gentle. So we've seen the word meek, we've seen the word humble, we've seen now the word gentle. And Paul urged Timothy to follow after meekness. In 1 Timothy 6 and verse 11, Brother Rex, read that for us.
But thou, O man of God, flee these things, and follow after righteousness, godliness, faith, love, patience, meekness.
All right. So there's the word meekness in the King James. And in the New King James, the New American Standard, and the New English Version, we have the word gentleness in the place of meekness. And let's look at one other one. The Colossians were told to put on meekness. In Colossians chapter 3 and verse 12, Stephen, read that one.
Put on therefore, as the elect of God, holy and beloved, vows of mercy, kindness, humbleness of mind, meekness, long-suffering.
So here we see meekness in the King James, New King James, and the English Standard, and the New American Standard uses the word gentleness. Now again, I'm using these other translations to help us to see the other words that are used instead of the word meek. And like we said before, meekness is not an easy word to give meaning to. So hopefully this helps us to see in use of some of these other words, at least the things that meekness associates and applies to. And some think about this, that since God commands meekness, it must mean that it doesn't in any way involve weakness. And I keep coming back to that because, as I said, I think the majority of people actually, in their mind, thinks that meekness is weakness. So when we consider that God commands meekness, He's not commanding weakness. God's commanding meekness. And so we need to understand what that word is. There are two examples, and again, these two examples we're just going to look at rather quickly because we're going to be dealing with them in detail in the next lesson, in lesson 6. Two examples to see that meekness is not weakness is in the case of Moses. In Numbers 12 and verse 3, Chan.
Now the man Moses was very meek, above all the men which were upon the face of the earth.
All right. So here we see meekness being associated directly to Moses. There's no question about it. And that of Christ in Matthew 11 and verse 29. Brother Deb, read that for us.
Christ, Matthew 11:29. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and you shall find rest unto your souls.
All right, so again, here is one to whom the statement is directly stated. The word is directly associated with Christ, as it was with Moses. So like I said, we're going to be looking at these two individuals a lot more in detail in Lesson 6, because that's what Lesson 6 is going to be dealing about, looking at the examples. We're trying to define in our study tonight what meekness is. And what I'm doing this for is to see that truly this popular concept that meekness is weakness is not at all what the word meek has reference to. And furthermore, what we see here in just the fact of the matter being that Moses and Christ were referred to as meek individuals, that suggests something else. Not that it's just not weakness, but it suggests that meekness is something that we have control over. It's not like some people think. We're either born with it or we're without it. We either have it or we don't. No, meekness, in the view of the fact of what we're seeing it being commanded, and in the examples of these two individuals, we see that we have control over whether or not we are meek. So it's something that we do have control over. So now that we've seen the verses where meekness is commanded, and we see the different words that are used in other translations, I want us to look at now some definitions. And we're going to take this one in segments. It's all written on your paper, but I want to take this in segments to make sure that we understand. It's a long definition, but let's look at it very carefully to make sure we understand the definition that's being given. And this is by one of the more familiar Greek dictionary individuals that we hear quoted from quite often, and that's W.E. Vine in his expository dictionary of New Testament words. He says, it is that temper of spirit in which we accept his dealings. His is capitalized, so that has reference to God or to Christ. So it's that temper of spirit in which we accept his dealings with us as good, and therefore without disputing or resisting. It's closely linked with the word humility, and it follows directly upon it. So let's look at that part of the definition. It's a word that is a temper of the spirit. It's a type of character that we develop, a virtue, a characteristic that we are to have. We're to develop it. And in so doing, we will accept whatever comes our way. Whatever it is that life throws at us, it's important for us to have meekness, because if we do, then we're going to be able to accept those things and without disputing and without resisting. So we see how closely then that we're dealing with a word that certainly has a lot of the characteristics of humility involved. There's a lot of humility involved in meekness. Not weakness, but humility. Being willing to accept the things that come our way. Now, the other part of the definition, this meekness, however, being first of all a meekness before God, is also such in the face of men, even of evil men, out of a sense that these, with the insults and the injuries which they may inflict, are permitted and employed by him for the chastising and the purifying of his elect. You know, also, all the time there's some people that say, well, why does God allow all the evil in the world? You know, God could put an end to it. But then God would not know whether we would serve him or serve Satan. So we see that even in the case of Job, God allowed things to occur to Job And God allows things to happen in the world today. He doesn't stop them. He doesn't prevent them. He doesn't anything like that. But in the facts of life, life being what it is, all of these things are allowed to happen. And it's a measure of our meekness. It's an indication. It's a thermometer of our meekness. So it's, first of all, a meekness before God. And then we must apply that meekness when it comes to our fellow man, even those who are our enemies, even those who slander, insult, and injure us. We're still to manifest meekness toward them, knowing that all of these things are a test. They're measures, like what we've been studying on Bible study on Sunday morning in the book of James, concerning the temptations, the trials that come our way. They serve one of two things. They can either make us stronger or they can make us weaker. So the trials and tribulations of life, even at the hands of those that are evil men, can either increase and strengthen us in our meekness or cause us to not be the meek person that we ought to be. In Galatians chapter 5, well, let's see, I'm not there yet. I just didn't put it up on the chart, did I? I'm sorry. In Galatians 5, verse 23, we see it associated, Vine says, with self-control. All right, there we go. See, we're back to what our study's been focusing on. Deny self, self-control. Let's look at Galatians 5 and verse 23. It's in the context of the fruit of the Spirit. And so verse 23 says, meekness, temperance, against such there is no law. So meekness and temperance are right there in one another's hip pockets. So I think we can see and hope that we can see that truly meekness has a major role when it comes to our doing what Jesus says, and that is, if we're going to come after him, let us deny ourselves. And then the other part of the definition says, the meaning, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this correct, praetes, this is what the word meekness comes from, is not readily expressed in English. And that's what we've been saying ever since, that this word is not an easy word to define. It's hard to put it into an English word that makes it simple. So he says that this word is not readily expressed in English, for the terms meekness, mildness, commonly used, suggest weakness and timidness to a greater or less extent, whereas praetes does nothing of the kind. So he's even saying that even though it's a common thing for people to associate weakness and being timid with meekness, the word itself is by no means that type of word with that type of meaning. Nevertheless, it says it's difficult to find a rendering less open to objection than meekness, gentleness, as been suggested. But as praetes describes, and this is an important point, as praetes describes a condition of mind and heart, and as gentleness is appropriate rather to actions, this word is no better than that used in both English versions. So it must be clearly understood, therefore, that the meekness manifested by the Lord and commended to the believers is the fruit of power. And he goes on to explain that. He says the common assumption is that when a man is meek, it's because he can't help himself. But the Lord was meek because he had the infinite resources of God at his command. Now, you may say, well, we don't have the infinite resources of God. Well, not to the extent that Jesus may have had. But, think about this verse. Think about Ephesians 3 and verse 20. Can you read that for us, Glenn?
To him that is able to do exceedingly abundantly above all that we ask or think, according to the power that worketh in us.
According to the power that worketh in us. So we have a power working in us. And that, of course, is the power that God has given to us through his word. That's the power of salvation. That's the power of the gift of the Holy Spirit that he has given to us. So we're not without power to express meekness in our lives as Christians. And then the final part of that, he says that, and I've done read that, the common assumption, but he says negatively, meekness is the opposite to self-assertiveness and self-interest. It's even temperament of spirit that's neither elated nor is it cast down, simply because it's not occupied with self at all. And isn't that what self-denial is? To deny self is to not have any interest in self at all. So I hope we see just in Vine's definition how truly we cannot get around studying denying self without studying meekness. Because even though it's a difficult word to understand and give a precise word-for-word definition to, we're seeing enough of it, and we're seeing it as it's translated, and as we're seeing it in the examples of others, and we're going to be seeing that more next time, that these are the qualities that certainly has to do with not asserting ourselves, not projecting ourselves, but instead being able to not be at all occupied with ourselves. And that's all coming from volume 3, page 55 and 56. So, I didn't want just to read the definition through because there's just so much there that needs to be stopped and considered and enlightened with not just on the Galatians that he uses, but in the verse in Ephesians chapter 3 and verse 20 that helps us to see the explanation of what he's talking about concerning the power that is to be had in order for us to possess and to display meekness under those circumstances, under those times. Another very familiar dictionary of the Greek language is Henry Thayer. And in his Greek English lexicon, he defines the word and translates meekness as gentleness, mildness. So he's very straightforward, very to the point in his definition. Now let's look at some just regular dictionary definitions of the word. Let's look at Funk and Wagnalls. They say it on page 792, define meekness as of gentle and long-suffering disposition, submission, compliant, humble. Remember we said a moment ago in talking about meekness that it's It was something that we do without murmuring or without arguing, complaining. So this is what it means to be compliant. And we'll be seeing that in some of the examples that we'll be looking at. The American Heritage Dictionary of the word says it means showing patience and humility, gentle submission. So there's no getting around the fact that meekness has everything to do with submission. And it has everything to do with submitting, not hesitantly, not rather that we hadn't, not submitting and complaining all the way, the whole while that we were being faithful. So that's not meekness. To have those kind of spirit, that kind of attitude, that kind of disposition. But meekness does have everything to do with disposition, with attitude, and the reasons of how we go about doing things. So we've looked at the dictionaries, both the English and the Greek, and the regular everyday dictionaries. Let's look at 2 or 3 commentaries here. William Barclay, in his Flesh and Spirit, says that the word meekness was used of animals which have been tamed and which have learned to accept discipline and control. Discipline and control. See, that has everything to do with denying self. Albert Barnes, in his notes on the New Testament, on Ephesians, Philippians, and Colossians, says meekness relates to the manner in which we receive injuries. We are to bear them patiently and not to retaliate or seek revenge. Remember, we said a moment ago that it's meekness that we put first and foremost toward God, but then it's also meekness that we put forth toward our fellow man, even those that are evil, even those that may be injuring us. And then I can't think of that, but what I can't think of the statement that Peter made concerning Jesus. When he was reviled, he reviled not again. When he suffered, he threatened not. What's the tendency to do if somebody is injuring you? To fight back, strike back. But that's not what Jesus did. Well, was it because he was weak? No. Remember, he could have called a legion of angels from heaven to come and take him down from the cross. So no, it wasn't weakness. It was submission. It was submission. It was being compliant. It was being of a long-suffering disposition. So I think Barnes has a good way of helping us to see. And then William Hendrickson, in the New Testament commentary on the Ephesians, in commenting on Ephesians 4 and verse 2, he said, the mention of lowliness leads naturally to that of meekness. The meek individual is slow to insist on his rights. And then he does this. He says, with Abraham, he preferred to let Lot have the first choice. And I'm sure we remember the context of Genesis 13. Abraham and Lot had a great substance between the two of them. And the land was just not able to bear the flocks. And so the time come for them to have to part ways. And it was Abraham. He was the patriarch. He could have said, Lot, I'm going this way, you go that way. No, he said, Lot, you choose. And whichever way you choose, I'll go the other direction. And then, of course, that's where the statement that has always stuck in my mind, that Lot pitched his tent towards Sodom. But still, the fact is, we see meekness in Abraham. He could have told Lot what to do. He was in that position. He had that kind of authority, but he didn't. He was meek. And he gave Lot the choice of where to go. So, and by the way, this passage in Ephesians 4 and verse 3, I thought I had it on the chart. Yeah, I do. Donnie, read that for us.
The mention of lowliness, I'm sorry, the mention written wrong first.
All right, the context of that actually starts in verse 1, where Paul said, therefore, I am the prisoner of the Lord. I beseech you that you walk worthy of the vocation wherewith you are called. And verse 2, do it with all lowliness and meekness, with long suffering, forbearing one another in love. So when we look, and as we have at all of this, let's do a little summarizing at this point. From all of the above verses, definitions, commentaries that we have examined, we can conclude that here are some things that meekness involves, without any shadow of doubt. Meekness involves humility. Humility toward God and man. Humility has to be toward both. It can't be just toward one. Humility, is all we've seen in these verses, is toward God and man. Another conclusion we can come to is that humility is submission to God's will. And what lesson 3 and lesson 4 was about in our study of denying self, submitting to the will of God. So we see it here in this word, in meekness. Another thing that we can conclude is that meekness is accepting the discipline that we receive. Regardless of at whose hands that we're receiving it. Evil men makes no difference. We need to be meek as Christians, just like Jesus did. What all that happened to Jesus, what was it? It was at the expense of evil men. But what did he do? He submitted. He was willing to accept the humility, the discipline. We can, I think, come to the conclusion that meekness is gentleness. It's mildness. And I think we see that in the life of Christ as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John records it. And meekness is self-control, or having that inner strength that it takes, and how that is so important when it comes to what our main study is on, and that is denying self. So, like I said, we may not have settled every question that you might have concerning meekness, but this has just been a start, because we want to look at this word even more. So time still gives us a little bit. Looking at the questions, why is meekness hard to define? Too many bad ideas that are out there. it's a difficult word, as we've said, in itself. But when you add all of the other things that people think about it, then it makes it even more difficult. So it's because of the many ideas that people have about what it means. They think that it's weakness. They think that it's a quality that we have no control over. They think that we either have it or we don't have it. They think meekness is something you're either born with or you're born without. And those all are not, I think, what we've seen in what we've studied. What is the synonym? And a synonym is just simply a word that's spelt different but means the same. And what is, in looking at these verses and looking at the other translations, what do we see some of those synonyms, some of those other words that were used in the place of meekness? Okay,
Ability.
all right. So gentleness, and humble. And we're asked to give 3 verses, although we had 4, that show us that God demands that we be meek. And one of those is Colossians 3, and Bill, read that for us.
Put on therefore as the elect of God, holy and beloved, bowels of mercy, kindness, humbleness of mind, meekness, long-suffering.
All right. And another verse you could have wrote down was 1 Timothy 6 and verse 11. Tim, read that for us.
But thou, O man of God, flee these things and follow after righteousness, godliness, faith, love, patience, meekness.
And another verse we could have wrote was 1 Peter 3 and verse 4. Jill, read that for us.
But let it be the hidden man of the heart, and that which is not corruptible, but ornament of a meek and quiet spirit, which is in the sight of God of great price.
All right. And then the other one, of course, could have been Zephaniah chapter 2 and verse 3. Dylan, read that for us.
Seek the Lord, all you meek of the earth, who have upheld his justice. Seek righteousness, seek humility. It may be that you will be hidden in the day of the Lord's anger.
And of course, like I said before, these are not all of the verses, but you have to put a stop to it somewhere. But at least these are enough to establish the point that God demands meekness. So that indicates that it is something that we do control. It is something that we need to have. And number 4, how would you show that meekness is not to be associated with weakness? What did we just say after we looked at the verses? God demands it. Okay?
Joy in the Lord is our strength.
So,
Joy in the Lord is our strength.
yes.
I don't see joy in any of those definitions. I wonder if any of those guys are Christians at all.
He said he didn't see joy listed in any of those definitions by any of those men, and he was questioning whether they were Christians, since they weren't considering joy.
Well, it was being addressed to Christians. It was being addressed to Christians. All of these verses that we saw there, Colossians 3, that was addressed to the church at Colossae.
No, I'm referring to the definitions. There's no joy in any of those definitions.
Oh,
It's certainly not strength.
well,
Where are you getting that word joy? I'm not
Old
saying you're
Testament.
wrong, I'm just asking.
Old Testament. Joy in the Lord is our strength.
But how are you associating that with meekness? this, the question I'm really getting at.
Well, I'm associating it with weakness. There ain't no weakness in the joy of in the Lord is our strength. That's not weakness.
I'm just curious, not trying to put you on the spot or anything.
That's all right.
I'm trying to understand the connection. Appreciate it.
So the one association I can see in joy is we know that what all Jesus went through, he endured everything and he was meek. But it also says, and I couldn't think of the verse right off, that for the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross. So that would be my closest association with joy in the context of everything that Jesus was enduring and all the while being meek in his endurance of it. Yet it was with joy.
Brother Hall,
Yes.
can I make a statement to the kids? You know, we've been studying here of late with Reuben about James chapter 1, where he says to count it all joy when you fall in diverse temptations. Well, again, you've got to consider that the Bible tells us that Jesus was a meek man. Well, when he was on that cross, suffering with nails in his hands and his feet, blood going everywhere, he's dying, you don't see joy there. Instead, you see meekness there. But he had the joy, nevertheless, in the long run, because he knew where he was headed. He had the joy of knowing what was going to happen. But joy, there was no association of joy whatsoever at that time when he was suffering pain and he knew he was going to die.
Good point. But it was the joy that was set before him.
How
He
about the
endured.
strength in Numbers 12? What was the very first scripture? 12:3. You don't get clobbered when God gets mad. That's straight.
What was the verse?
Numbers 4:12.
Romans 4:12.
2:3. It's on your list, right at the top.
Numbers 12:3, I think.
12:3.
It says you will, by being meek, you will avoid God's wrath. That's a form of strength right there.
Okay. Well, time is up, and we'll go ahead and let's see. We know that, let's just finish this right quick. We know that meekness is not associated with weakness because God commands it, and Moses and Jesus are examples, and they certainly was not weak. And Barclay said that meekness is used of what? Animals that have been what? Tamed and have learned to accept discipline and control. So we see how these things factor in to the word that we're studying tonight. So Lord willing, we'll do our study lesson 6, and that's where we'll be dealing with the examples. So appreciate our study tonight, and